Picture a Tuesday evening. No fight, no slammed door, no dramatic moment you could point to later and say, that was it. Just a man sitting across from someone he loves, saying something true about himself, something he believes, and watching that person calmly, almost gently, take it apart. Not with cruelty, with precision. And the man nods, because by now he's not sure anymore. Maybe they're right. Maybe he is overreacting. Maybe he is too sensitive. Maybe the version of himself he thought he knew was always a little off. That moment, that quiet erosion, that's where this conversation begins. By the end of this episode, you'll have a name for what happened to you. You'll also have 3 tools Marcus Aurelius used to protect his own mind inside one of the most politically treacherous courts in Roman history. Not theory, disciplines, things a man can use on a Monday morning. Welcome to Stoic and Ancient Philosophy. I'm Patrick, and with me, as always, is Gary. Gary, before we even get into Marcus Aurelius today, I want to sit with that image for a second. Because I think a lot of men listening right now, they recognize it, not from a book, from last week.
They do. And I think the reason it's so recognizable and so disorienting is that it doesn't look like damage from the outside. There's no visible wound. A man can't point to it. He just notices one day that he trusts himself less than he used to.
And that's the thing, right? It's not a single event, it's accumulation.
Exactly. It's sediment, layer by layer. And at some point, the weight of it changes how a man moves through the world, without him ever deciding to change.
So what are we actually talking about here? For the man who's maybe just starting to put a name to this, what is the mechanism?
The mechanism is the erosion of self-trust, and it works precisely because it targets the one thing Marcus Aurelius considered most sacred: the inner life, the private retreat. Marcus says people look for peace in places, but the quietest refuge has to be cultivated within. Now, think about what a narcissistic dynamic actually does. It doesn't take your money. It doesn't take your job. It takes that. It makes the inner retreat feel contested, unsafe. Like even your own mind is a place where someone else's voice has squatter's rights.
That's a striking way to put it, squatter's rights.
Because that's what it is. You didn't invite the doubt in, but it moved in anyway. And now it sits in the chair that used to be yours.
And the man doesn't even realize it's happening because the person doing it isn't necessarily doing it consciously. That's what makes it so destabilizing.
Right. And here's where I want to be precise, because this matters. We're not here to diagnose anyone's partner. We're not therapists. What we are here to do is give a man the language and the framework to understand what happened to his inner life. And Marcus Aurelius wrote under intense political pressure and knew what it meant to guard his inner life amid instability.
He was surrounded by it.
Every single day, senators who smiled and conspired, advisors whose loyalty shifted with the wind. And yet, he held his ground, not by fighting harder, by knowing what was his and what wasn't. That's what we're rebuilding today.
I want to stay with the fog for one more moment, though, because I think men underestimate how physical this is. This isn't just a mindset problem.
No, this can affect self-trust, stress response, and perception over time. When a person is subjected to chronic reality distortion, what is often described as gaslighting can leave someone confused about their own perceptions. Repeated emotional distortion can condition how a person interprets events. The self-assessment circuitry. A person may begin to rely less on their own judgment, not out of weakness, out of adaptation. Often people adapt to their emotional environment in ways that can reduce confidence in their own judgment.
Which means the fog isn't a character flaw.
It's a response, a rational response to an irrational environment. And that distinction, that single reframe, is often the first thing that allows a man to stand back up.
Think of it this way. Imagine a boxer, gifted, technically sound, who's been told for 2 years by his trainer, his corner, the people closest to him, that his left hook is weak, telegraphed, useless. So he stops throwing it. He restructures his entire game around that belief. And then one day, a different coach watches him on tape and says, "Your left hook is one of the cleanest I've seen. Why aren't you using it?" The punch was never weak. The belief was the injury.
And the work, the real work, isn't learning a new punch. It's unlearning the lie about the one you already had.
Now, here's what I want you to hold on to as we move into the next part of this conversation. The fog isn't random. It isn't bad luck. It isn't two people who were just incompatible. Marcus Aurelius names a pattern many people struggle to articulate clearly. The fog is a strategy, and once you can see the strategy, everything changes. So the fog is a strategy. That's a hard thing to sit with, because it changes the story a man has been telling himself. It's no longer, we were just incompatible. It's no longer, relationships are complicated. It's something more specific than that and more uncomfortable. Gary, walk us through it. What is actually happening inside one of these dynamics?
Let's start with Epictetus, because he gives us the most precise map. In the Enchiridion, his handbook essentially, the very first line reads, "Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions." That's the foundation of Stoic philosophy in 2 sentences. What's yours? Your judgments, your values, your responses. What's not yours? Everything outside that boundary. Now, a narcissistic dynamic doesn't attack your bank account. It doesn't attack your body. It attacks precisely the things Epictetus says are yours. Your opinion of yourself, your desires, your perception of reality. It goes straight for the interior.
Which is why it's so hard to defend against.
Because you're not defending against something external. You're defending against a version of yourself that's been quietly replaced.
So what are the actual vectors? How does it work in practice?
There are 3. And I want to name them plainly, without clinical distance. Because a man needs to recognize these in his own life, not in a textbook. The first is love withdrawal. Affection, warmth, presence, given freely, then withheld. Not as punishment that's announced, as weather, unpredictable. And the man learns, over time, to manage his behavior around the forecast. The second is reality revision. A conversation happened. He knows what was said. And then, gently, persistently, the record gets corrected. That's not what I meant. You're misremembering. You always do this. Enough repetitions, and a man stops trusting his own account of events. The third is identity erosion. The slow, cumulative narrowing of who he's allowed to be. His humor is too much. His ambitions are unrealistic. His friendships are a threat, until the version of himself that remains is small enough to manage.
Hearing it laid out like that, it's almost architectural.
That's exactly the right word. It is architecture. It's a structure. And structures, once you can see them, lose a significant portion of their power.
But here's what I keep coming back to, Gary. And I think a lot of men listening are thinking the same thing. Can someone really be that calculated without even knowing it? Because when I hear strategy, I hear intention, I hear deliberate, and I'm not sure every person in this dynamic is sitting there planning it.
That's the most important question in this entire conversation. And the honest answer is no. Most of the time, they're not planning it. These patterns are not always consciously planned. Often, they appear as entrenched relational habits rather than explicit strategy. patterns that can become deeply ingrained over time.
So it's not malice?
Not necessarily, but Marcus Aurelius, in his private journals, returns to one principle again and again. You cannot control what another person does, only your response to it. From that position, the question of intent becomes secondary. For Marcus, the obstacle is not the end of action. It becomes the material you work with. The obstacle isn't the other person's psychology. The obstacle is your own response to it. That's where the work lives.
The intent of the other person doesn't change your exit strategy.
Precisely. Epictetus doesn't ask you to diagnose the people around you. He asks you to locate the boundary between what is yours and what is not. That's the work. Not the other person's psychology, yours.
Now, I want to bring in something from behavioral psychology here, because I think it explains why these dynamics are so adhesive, why a man doesn't just leave.
Intermittent reinforcement.
Exactly. And this is worth understanding because it reframes the question of why a man stays and removes the shame from it entirely. The hot and cold cycle, warmth, then withdrawal, then warmth again. It's not emotional instability. Psychologically, it functions as a retention system. Unpredictable reward patterns can become especially compelling, which is one reason these dynamics are so hard to leave. It's the same mechanism behind a slot machine. You don't keep pulling the lever because you're winning. You keep pulling it because you might.
And a man in that cycle isn't weak. He's human. He's responding in a deeply human way to the possibility of connection. The problem isn't his capacity for love. The problem is that capacity is being used against him.
Which brings us back to Epictetus. At that point, the dichotomy of control is no longer abstract philosophy. It becomes a practical discipline. Stop pulling the lever. Return to what is yours.
And Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by exactly this kind of dynamic, every day of his reign, built something to protect himself from it, a structure of his own.
And that structure has a name. We'll get there. But first, I want you to understand why you need it. Because the hardest moment in all of this isn't the insight. It isn't the conversation where everything becomes clear. It's the Monday morning after, when they text, when they're kind again, when the fog rolls quietly back in. That's when the structure either holds or it doesn't. The Monday morning after. A man wakes up, the conversation from the night before is still sitting in his chest, and then the phone lights up, a message, warm, almost tender, like none of it happened, and something in him moves toward it. Not because he's foolish, not because he didn't hear everything we just said, but because the pull is real, and insight on its own is not a wall. Gary, that's the gap, isn't it? Between understanding something and being protected by it.
That's exactly the gap. And it's the gap Marcus Aurelius spent his entire reign trying to close. Not for a relationship, for an empire, for a court full of people whose loyalty was conditional and whose motives were rarely visible. He needed something that could hold, not just in the moments of clarity, but in the moments of pressure.
And he found it.
He built it, deliberately, entry by entry, in those private journals we now call the Meditations. Marcus compares the disciplined inner life to a fortress no external pressure can easily breach. A fortress, not a metaphor for comfort, a fortress for the mind.
And that's where the phrase comes from, the inner citadel.
Here's where I want to be precise, because this matters for intellectual honesty. Marcus Aurelius didn't use those exact words. The phrase inner citadel belongs to a French philosopher named Pierre Hadot. His 1992 study, The Inner Citadel, The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. is one of the most rigorous examinations of Stoic practice ever written. Hadot coined the term as a scholarly lens, a way of naming what Marcus was doing across hundreds of entries. But the concept lives in the meditations themselves. Book 8. The soul as fortress, the ruling faculty, what the Greeks called the hegemonikon, as the one part of a man that cannot be breached without his consent.
So when we say inner citadel, we're using Hadot's language to describe Marcus Aurelius's practice.
Precisely. And it's worth naming that distinction, because the practice is real, and it works regardless of who named it.
So what is it practically? What does it actually mean to have an inner citadel for a man sitting in his car on a Monday morning reading that text?
It means there is a part of him, a faculty, a center, that the text cannot reach. Not because he's numb, not because he doesn't feel it, but because he has practiced deliberately, returning to that center before he responds. In the Stoic tradition, this discipline is often described as prosos, attentive awareness of one's own judgments, the daily discipline of watching your own mind the way a sentry watches a gate, not to suppress what enters, to choose what you allow to take root.
And that's the difference between a reaction and a response.
That's the entire difference. A reaction is the fog moving back in, unchallenged. A response is a man who has located his center and acts from there.
Now, there's a parallel here that I think is worth sitting with, because this isn't only a Western idea.
No, and I think it's important to say that, because it suggests we're not talking about a philosophy. We're talking about something closer to a human truth. In Zen practice, there's a concept called mushin, literally, no mind. But that's a misleading translation. It doesn't mean emptiness. It means a mind without obstruction, a mind that isn't cluttered by the need for approval, the fear of rejection, the compulsive replaying of old conversations. The narcissistic dynamic, at its core, is a machine that runs on your need for their approval. Mushin is the state in which that machine has no fuel.
The lighthouse image.
Say more.
A lighthouse doesn't chase the ships. It doesn't argue with the storm. It doesn't dim its light because the weather turns hostile. It holds its position and it keeps the light on. That's the inner citadel. That's mushin, not the absence of feeling, the presence of ground.
And Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, in the very first line of his very first letter, gives a man perhaps the most direct instruction in all of ancient philosophy for this exact moment. He writes, in Latin, and I'll give you both, ita fac mi Lucili, vindica te tibi. Do this, my Lucilius, claim yourself for yourself. Not reclaim, not fight back, not demand anything from anyone else. Claim yourself for yourself.
And that's the whole thing, isn't it? That's the entire practice in 4 words.
4 words written 2,000 years ago. To a man who was, in his own way, navigating exactly what the man listening to this right now is navigating. The names change. The dynamic doesn't.
And here's what I want to leave you with before we get to the practices in our final segment. The inner citadel isn't something you find. It's something you return to. It was always there. It was there before the relationship, before the fog, before the first Tuesday evening, when something true about you got quietly taken apart. It didn't disappear. It got buried. And the work, the real work, is not reconstruction. It's excavation. Excavation. That's where we left it. And I want to stay with that word for just a moment because it changes the nature of the work. If you're rebuilding, you need raw materials. You need to manufacture something new. But if you're excavating, you're not building anything. You're removing what doesn't belong. You're clearing the ground to find what was always there. That's a fundamentally different posture. And it matters because a man who's been through one of these dynamics often believes he's broken, that the version of himself he needs to become is somewhere out ahead of him. Gary, what does philosophy say to that man?
It says, "You are not broken. You are buried." And the Stoics were extraordinarily precise about this. Epictetus, a man who was literally enslaved, who had no external freedom whatsoever, never once wrote as though his essential self had been damaged. Constrained, yes. Pressured, yes. But the hegemonicon, the ruling faculty, the center, he treated as inviolable. Not because he was naive about suffering, because he had tested that premise under conditions most of us will never face.
And it held.
It held. So when we talk about practices, we're not talking about self-improvement in the modern sense. We're not optimizing. We're not upgrading. We're talking about returning, deliberately, repeatedly, to what was always yours.
3 practices. Let's name them.
The first is what I'd call the morning inventory. Marcus Aurelius, in Meditations, Book 2, Entry 1, opens with something that sounds, on the surface, almost pessimistic. He writes, "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." Now, most people read that and think, what a bleak way to start a day.
It's the opposite, though.
It's the opposite, because what Marcus is doing is removing the element of surprise. He's not catastrophizing. He's preparing. He's locating his expectations inside reality, not inside hope. For a man coming out of a narcissistic dynamic, the morning is the most dangerous hour, because the mind, still half asleep, reaches for the old patterns. It rehearses the conversations. It replays the warmth. It anticipates the text. The morning inventory interrupts that loop. Before you pick up the phone, before you check anything, you sit. 60 seconds. You name, plainly, what the day may bring. Not what you fear, not what you hope, what is likely. And you locate your center before the world gets a vote.
You're building the wall before the weather arrives.
Every single morning, because the wall doesn't maintain itself.
Practice 2.
The boundary audit. Epictetus, Enchiridion, Entry 1. We've returned to it twice in this conversation, and I want to return to it a third time, because repetition is how the Stoics taught, not as redundancy, as reinforcement. Some things are in our control, and others not. The boundary audit is a written practice, not a mental exercise, written. Because the fog we described in segment 1 is a cognitive phenomenon. It lives in the mind, and writing externalizes it. It puts the fog on paper, where you can see it clearly. Once a day, ideally in the evening, a man takes a single sheet. 2 columns. Left column. What I attempted to control today that was not mine to control. Right column. What was actually mine.
And you'd be surprised the first time you do it how short the right column is.
And how crowded the left one. But over time, that ratio shifts, not because the world becomes more controllable, because the man becomes more precise about where he places his attention. Over time, this repeated distinction can change a person's habits of attention and judgment, not through willpower, through repetition of a clear, simple distinction.
The brain follows the habit of the mind.
Consistently, without exception.
And the third practice?
The third is the most ancient, and in some ways, the most demanding. Seneca, writing to Lucilius in Letter 7, Section 8 of the Epistulae Moralis, gives a man one of the most precise instructions in all of ancient philosophy. He writes, in Latin, "Recede into ipse quantum potes." Withdraw into yourself as much as you can. Not retreat as defeat, not isolation as avoidance, withdrawal as an act of reclamation. a deliberate return to your own interior, away from the noise of a dynamic that has trained you to live entirely in reaction to someone else.
There's a difference between withdrawing from something and withdrawing into something.
That's exactly the distinction Seneca is drawing. He's not telling Lucilius to disappear. He's telling him to stop outsourcing his inner life, to stop measuring his own reality by the temperature of someone else's mood. And in the Zen tradition, there's a parallel practice, ichi go ichi I, literally, one time, one meeting. The discipline of being fully present to this moment. Not the last conversation, not the next text, this moment, this cup of coffee, this breath, this page. The practice is simple. Once a day, not for an hour, not for 30 minutes, for 10 minutes, you do one thing, completely, without the phone, without the background noise of the dynamic still running in your head. You read a page, you walk a block, you make something with your hands, not as escape, as reclamation.
You're practicing being present to your own life.
Which is, when you think about it, the thing that was most systematically taken. Not your confidence, not your ambition, your presence, your ability to inhabit your own experience without constantly monitoring how it's being received by someone else. Withdraw into yourself. Claim that ground back. One 10-minute window at a time.
3 practices, a morning inventory, a boundary audit, a daily act of withdrawal, back into yourself. None of them require the other person to change. None of them require a conversation, a confrontation, a resolution. They require only one thing, a decision, made quietly, in the early morning, before the phone lights up. The decision to be, again, the author of your own interior life.
Marcus Aurelius ran an empire from that decision. Epictetus survived slavery on it. Seneca wrote some of the most enduring prose in Western history from a position of political exile. None of them had easy circumstances. All of them had the citadel.
And so do you. That's our conversation for today. If something in this landed, sit with it. Don't rush to share it. Don't rush to apply it. Just let it settle. The Stoics didn't believe in overnight transformation. They believed in daily practice, small, consistent, unglamorous. The kind of work that doesn't look like anything from the outside until one morning you wake up and the fog is gone. Not because they changed, because you came home. Next Friday, we go deeper because once you've found the citadel, the question becomes, how do you make sure you never lose it again? We're talking about identity, about the stories men tell themselves after damage. Marcus Aurelius had something to say about that too.
Vindica te tibi.
Claim yourself for yourself. We'll see you next Friday.